We're going to talk about a Mythbusters kind of production here about compartment syndrome in order to make it a little more enjoyable. My disclosures are pertinent. In particular, my labs turned out a bunch of companies, one of them being Myo1, which Dr. Layton and Dr. Bernstein used to get the data I show later on, the independent studies for me, so I'm okay presenting it. And compartment syndrome started for me about 10 years ago. It was a real problem for me. I think it's a problem for everybody, and our practice is sort of not optimal. And one of the myths I wanted to bust was that we had to practice medicine around compartment syndrome according to the lawyers, which I don't like. So we did that by publishing. We have about 35 publications in press or coming out in the next couple of months. The first myth that we kind of went after was the epidemiology. So when I was a resident, I was just taught, well, just young males get this, only people that get it. So we went about kind of busting that by publishing. We looked at a bunch of databases, including the DoD and the TQIP database and Canadian databases. And we looked at about 204,000 tibia fractures to figure out really what happens in the epidemiology. We published that multiple times about different body parts. So basically what we found that was kind of new was that ACS is associated with other things like cirrhosis, with hypertension being preventative. So everyone kind of thought when we went into this that pressure didn't work, but we kind of got this impression after doing the database search that it was going to be important in some way. We also showed that amputation resulted after in 1 in 20 fasciotomies were performed in America, and everyone goes, well, not in my practice, I don't have an amputation. It's like, this is all the data in the US, this is what really happens, so you can't really get around that. 1 in 6 fasciotomies already had necrosis, so we're doing surgery too late, and that fasciotomies were actually being done at 4 times the rate of ACS in order to protect us from lawsuits, which is not optimal, and there's a high infection rate. So the other myth we approached was that basically we were able to make this diagnosis with clinical signs. Going in, I thought I could. I thought that, you know, if you didn't make the diagnosis, you just weren't paying attention to the patient. We actually went back and redid some of that because you could see in the literature there was this leaning kind of persuasion that we were not doing a very good job, that we weren't good at doing this clinically, but we still thought it was the gold standard, right? So we went back and redid all the meta-analysis that were in the literature, and we actually used the original data from Ulmer. That's the paper that the lawyers quote when they have us in court. They say, well, 93% of the time you can diagnose this if you have 3 Ps. And we went back and did that. And it's actually, if you look at it with Bayesian data, it's about 21%. Not really 93%, but a little worse. And that's why we're having trouble diagnosing it, right? So that myth about the Ps, probably not right. And we thought we'd drive that point home by looking at that in more depth. We just published this in JBGS 2 days ago, actually, for people who are following the PubMed. But we looked at Ps over multiple trauma centers, including 3 in the US, which were Hennepin, Harborview, and Vanderbilt, to see if us as the experts were very good at using the Ps to diagnose compartment syndrome. So this is going to be a graph come up here that shows in black patients that had ACS, and gray the ones that did not have ACS after fasciotomy for compartment syndrome. So these are all patients that the experts thought had compartment syndrome and did an operation on. And if you look at this, pain, which we really rely on as being our #1 indicator of compartment syndrome, is a coin flip, 50-50. Whether you use that as an indicator for compartment syndrome, you're only right 50% of the time. And if you use pallor or pulselessness, actually it was negatively correlated with compartment syndrome, so we're doing the wrong thing. And the only thing that looked like it might be kind of indicative is pressure palpation. You know that kind of tight sensation that you get when you assess the patient? So we sort of looked at that as being one of the 7th Ps, but the Ps were not very useful. Even when you stack the Ps together, going 1 to 7 Ps in patients, it didn't really work. If it worked, the curve would look something like that, 100% sensitive specific when you got to 7 Ps, right? It never really happened. So the Ps, as a myth, busted. So we looked at palpation of pressure, because that was the 7th P that wasn't really taught in med school, and that's been looked at already. And in legs, in the hand, and the forearm, experts can't tell when the compartments are full. So we're really left with no Ps of the 7 Ps, which was one of the myths we came up with to bust. So what I thought initially, you know, if someone asked me if I could make that diagnosis, I would have said, yeah, I can make that diagnosis. If I had 4 Ps, I'll make that diagnosis. It probably is not right. You can't do it early enough to make a change because we're having a lot of patients with necrosis, right? If you wait till the compartments are rock hard, everyone can make the diagnosis. It's just a little late. So that's when we thought we'd kind of need a biomarker that was more objective, a number. And it was like a 5-year kind of journey in the lab. So I have a sensor lab where we had access to pressure sensors and pH and temperature and partial pressure of oxygen. We could make any sensor we wanted, actually. And it took about 5 years to come up with the data that I'm going to show you. So we found that MEMS pressure sensors were more accurate. It's basically put a microchip inside the muscle and it reads pressure directly. So it doesn't matter where you are, you're on a submarine or an airplane, you're going to get real pressure, right? And we published that in the Military Medicine Journal first because they supplied the money to do all this research. So we had a huge DoD grant, which I'm very thankful for, that we could get this done with that. And we published that, and we showed that what was currently, at that time, in use wasn't very accurate, and that if you put a chip inside the muscle, it was much more accurate. And that allowed us to do a lot of other things and bust a few more myths, like the fact that single pressure measurement makes any difference at all, right? That there's some kind of magic number doesn't make any difference at all. So this is a patient with a continuous sensor put in their leg. It's a normal patient. Patient pressure went in at 40, went up to 80 to 120 at times when the patient was moving around. When I was a resident, I was taught if it ever showed 40, you cut it, right? This is a patient walking around the street. So pretty well kind of blows that idea that there's a magic number that we're going to have to do something about, right? And if you look at some of these data this is from the first 1,000 patients, you can see that when the pressure sensor goes in, it's much higher than with time it kind of breaks, so the spasm breaks. So that number you get when you first goes in is probably wrong. We looked at single points being less effective. So here's a patient, you say, well, okay, I won't do a single point, I'm going to do 3 points over 8 hours, right? So here's a patient that had 3 points over 8 hours, and that's what the 3 points look like. But if you look at the continuous pressure data, the pressure looks more like this, which is a downward trend with some spikes. So therefore, this patient didn't need a fasciotomy and didn't get one. And this patient, by having continuous data, we're able to avoid fasciotomies. So we next really wanted to compare studies. We said, okay, we've got this new data. Can we compare it to the old studies and see what's going on in the literature? Well, actually, we couldn't because there was no comparison to be made. It was apples and oranges. We didn't have a classification system. So we set about doing that as well as part of this exercise over the last few years. And we built a grading system. It was validated, it was published in JOT. Basically, that had some patients, 4s and 5s. Everyone agreed those are bad. Those are the ones we're trying to avoid. Those are the ones we get sued about. The class 1s were the ones that we just did a fasciotomy for like, oh, it might get ACS, we'll do a fasciotomy. That's no harm, no foul, right? So that was the classification agreed on. What can you do with a common communication language? Well, you can figure out how much this costs, which we couldn't before. There's 4 independent publications that I'm not involved in, either coming out or in press, about what it costs to have compartment syndrome. And what was interesting is that when we first started this exercise, we wanted to avoid these 4s and 5s. But the really important economic problem is number 1, people who get fasciotomies for no reason. And that's really where the money is in stopping these false positives for the hospital system, for the patient's outcomes. And these 4 groups looked at it, I mentioned before. This is Milan Sen's work from New York, and he looked at standard of care being around $56,000. If you add an unnecessary fasciotomy, you're adding around $18,000 to the cost of the patient. And when YHEC, who's the NHS gatekeeper for all new instruments going into England, looked at it, they said, well, if you had the right device, whatever it was, if it cost $4,800, would still be a neutral wash on this. So if you had any device that was magically could solve compartment syndrome and it cost less than $4,800, would pay everyone to use it. So the myth we busted was that fasciotomies were safe and the best option. If you do a fasciotomy, that unnecessary fasciotomy, patients are in the hospital for 8 extra days. So if a vascular surgeon does it, it's 16 extra days. So 20% infection rate and there's long-term issues with patient outcomes. So those fasciotomies are not so benign. And then we kind of looked at what happened with the non-MEMS-based and exam. This is a patient, the study from Ross Layton and Ducote's group. I think it was published 2 weeks ago. Ross, is that true? You got something? So it's out there somewhere. So the data was kind of interesting. They found that they had no missed cases of ACS, no false positive negatives, over 150 clinical cases in 2 independent studies. And you say, well, those are like studies. Well, there's 2,100 cases now that have been done through the company that show the same results. So what do you have at the end of this? Instead of having a single point pressure measurement, it doesn't really work. You have this. You have kind of pressure trend over 8 hours that shows that you're going to get ACS before you get pain, before O2 changes, before pH changes or anything. So the earliest biomarker is actually pressure changes. And you can see this in the results from the Layton and Bernstein studies. If you look in the quintiles, the patients in blue did not get ACS, and they all trended down. No matter where they started, if you trend down, you didn't get ACS. If you trended up, you got ACS. And we were able to make this diagnosis in obtunded patients. These are 2 patients post-tibial nail that were blocked. You see the one in blue probably would have got a fasciotomy under the old regime, did not get a fasciotomy. The person in red, no symptoms, developed ACS overnight and got a fasciotomy in the morning. She had ACS. We would have lost that leg if we couldn't have examined, because we couldn't examine her. The other myth that came up with this was that you have to examine all 4 compartments. You have to measure it in all 4 compartments. And that really wasn't true. You only need to measure in 1 compartment. This is a publication in JBJS 3 years ago. If you can look it up, it's a kind of complex study with multiple findings. But this is one slide from that. The gray area is infused fluid. These are infused fluid in the legs using a sensor in all 4 compartments. You can see no matter what compartment you blow up, all compartments went up in pressure. And I told you already that the absolute number doesn't mean much, it's the trend. So if the trend is up, they have ACS, and that was proven in the cadaver study. So this is from the Layton-Cott study, showed that pain wasn't very useful, which we already knew from the meta-analysis, but now we have clinical prospective data showing that. These are patients that had compartment syndrome and didn't have compartment syndrome. You can see the VAS score was all over the map. So that's kind of a myth that you could use pain as an indicator, but it seemed that perfusion pressure was a little bit better indicator. And as we get more patients, we'll have better data on this. But we now have an objective data that will tell you when you have ACS, it's a trend in perfusion pressure. And then the overarching goal of this was to eliminate variability in both physician care patient care and physician diagnosis. And we sort of did that by rolling out a protocol. Duckworth had first mentioned this in Rockwood and Green, it's a chapter publication from last year, where the patients in blue were the ones they monitor in Edinburgh. And if you monitored them, if you thought they had ACS, they went to the OR. If you didn't think they had ACS, but they were in this high-risk group, they all got monitored with continuous pressure trends. And they were in the green, red, or yellow group, and they would go on to get ACS fasciotomy or not, or just be treated conservatively. And we had this protocol, but we didn't have such success until we put it in place in the hospital. And so basically, we put this as mandatory for the residents now. This eliminated all variability in care. So basically, it automatically happens. We had lost 2 legs in our system, despite having the device available, because people would go, no, I can make that diagnosis, despite all the data that we showed. And then they said, no, I'll just make that diagnosis, and we lost 2 legs. So the program director said, okay, that's not going to happen anymore. We just put this protocol in place, and we've been successful since then. So I'd like to thank everyone for putting up with this little Mythbusters syndrome, on ICS syndrome. I thank my co-authors. It's been busy 5 to 10 years. When I started this, my kids looked like that, and now they look like this, right? So it took a while. Thanks.